What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are starting Chapter 1 of Defining Moments in Black History by Dick Gregory. If you enjoy the episode, hit that like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 1. Searching for Freedom. It was in the New York Times that there are 1.5 million black men missing. They are not in jail. I couldn't imagine where they were until I saw the movie Get Out. He has these little blurbs at the beginning of the chapter. He was a comedian as well as an activist. I'm sure you know that. Everyone knows that slavery wasn't right. Not just human slavery, but all forms of slavery are wrong. Folks that own dogs and cats and other animals should recognize that they are practicing a form of slavery. The same universal God that made me and you also made dogs and cats. Straight up. When you own a dog, you determine when it's going to mate, when it's going to pee, when it's going to eat, when it's going to take a crap. You have to see that slavery, because once you start off with the idea of something as being beneath you, you're lost. I tell people you'll find out on Judgment Day. You'll see a slave master and you will all be in the same room waiting to get that train to hell. When you submit to another human being and let him do something to you, that violates God, violates the universe. During the slave trade, hundreds of thousands of Africans jumped off the ships carrying them and died. Our revolts against slavery are what I like to focus on, as well as the ways slavery psychologically impacted all of society. Think about it. Somebody comes over to where you're living, someone you've never seen, because you've never seen white folks. They've come there to steal your children and to send you, the dad, to one place, the mama someplace else, and the brother yet someplace else. During slavery, the women were of equal value to the men. Listen, there isn't another man in the world besides the black man who looks at his woman and says, "I'm going to get some of that booty." Have you ever heard that word used referring to a woman of another race? You know what it means? The loot the pirate takes off the ship is called booty. So this woman, who's never been liberated, we call what she has booty. I believe this is a direct result of slavery. We arrive in a new land. The people in America do not speak my tongue, and they do not practice my religion. Today people laugh at me and want to know why I speak English so bad. Because when the whites brought me over here, I wasn't speaking anything but pure Swahili, that's why. They should not try to embarrass me. The same God that made the sun made me. I went and looked at all the 7 wonders of the world, and I came back and I said, wow, none of them was made by God. How come the ocean isn't one? I went to Egypt. A man there told me that Egypt has the 3rd largest tourist economy in the world. Everybody comes to see the pyramids. So the Egyptian said, "I'd like for you and your friend to join us tonight where the super rich go to sleep under the pyramid." I said, "Man, look at this here." I pointed at my nose. "That's the pyramid, you understand? And as long as I sleep on my back, I get 1,000 times more energy than I'd get from that mess you're selling. My nose is my pyramid. God made it." The middle passage. Slavery in America... Sorry, Hermione. Slavery in America didn't start with black folks. In the 1500s, dudes from Spain and Portugal were over here enslaving Indians. That's what they called the natives living here, Indians. because when that dummy Christopher Columbus came here, he thought he had reached India and the mistake stuck. So they took those poor Indians from their homes and sent them every which way to work in mines and fields in the Caribbean, Peru, and Panama. The ones who hadn't already died from being exposed to European germs, that is. Then word got back to the King of Spain, Charles V, about how bad the Indians were being treated, and he outlawed slavery in the so-called New World. Of course, it wasn't new to the people who had been living there. Too bad Charles waited until after most of the natives had been worked to death or died of disease, huh? Plus, Charles didn't have control over what the other European countries did. Even after Spain backed off, Portugal was still in the game, and then the Dutch got involved, and then, watch out, there came the English. When the English started setting up colonies over here in the Americas in the 1600s, let me tell you, that was bad news for black folks. The English wanted slaves too. For a while, they used poor white folks from back home as what they called indentured servants. But that didn't work out too well because they had to honor the servants' contracts or else the servants ran away. And because the servants were white, they could blend right in wherever they went. Guess who couldn't blend in? And so the English and other countries soon set their sights on Africans, and the slave business was on for real. Now the Middle Passage, that's what they called the trip that brought slaves by ship from Africa to the Americas. Think for a second about why it's called the Middle Passage. For something to be in the middle, it's got to be between two other things. And those two other things tell you what the whole deal was really about. The Middle Passage was the second leg of the journey. The first leg started in Europe. Folks from countries like Spain and Portugal, but also England and France. The same folks we think of today when we think of grace, style, and good manners, they went to Africa and traded some cheap crap they had made for live Africans. Notice I didn't say slaves. We weren't slaves till we got here. Then on the Middle Passage, they brought the Africans to America and the Caribbean and traded these living, breathing people, or rather the ones who were still living and breathing, to white folks here for stuff they could take back with them to Europe. The third leg of the journey was the trip back across the ocean to the homes of those dainty, graceful, civilized, slave-trading European bastards. The main word here is trading. That's what the whole thing was about. The people who started the slave trade didn't hate Africans, didn't hate black folks. They didn't care about us one way or another until they realized they could make money by capturing us and selling us as free labor. It was when the Africans got here and became American black folks that the real hating started. To justify keeping somebody as a slave, you've got to say, and you've got to believe it, that the person is not a real human. And the more human people seem to you, the more you've got to tell yourself they're not. If whites had admitted to themselves that they could treat other humans in such a horrible manner, it would have meant admitting that they themselves had a problem acting like human beings. So their questioning our humanity had more to do with them than with us. One of the reasons that racism doesn't end is because we're seen as a commodity, not as human beings. You know and I know that the Africans brought over here on those slave ships were as human as anybody else. That's what makes me think about what our ancestors endured during the Middle Passage so horrible. But we need to think about it because it's our history. Think about the last time you were on a bus or subway car on a hot summer day when the air conditioner wasn't working. You're squeezed in like socks in a drawer fresh from the laundry, except fresh is not the right word. The dude in front of you is sweating like a farmer. The dude behind you smells like he took a bath in pig manure, and pretty soon you get to sweating and smelling your own self. Now imagine that instead of sitting or standing up, you're all lying down. Imagine that instead of just starting and stopping, like a bus or a subway usually does, the thing you're on rises and falls like a roller coaster, making you sick to your stomach. And imagine that your stop never seems to come. An hour passes, a day, a week, 2 weeks, but your stop still doesn't come. Then when it does come, you can't get off because you're shackled to the dude next to you. Maybe you start talking to each other. Pretty soon you're both crying because neither one of you knows where you're going or what's going to happen when you get there, or whether you'll ever see your wife or your son or your daughter or mother or brother again. Then you notice that you've been doing all the talking and it's been a while since your new friend said anything. Maybe he's sleeping. Then you realize that no, he's not sleeping. He's dead. Now you're really crying. Or you would be, except the odor down there has gotten so bad that you start to vomit instead. Now there's vomit all over you and nothing in your stomach, and you don't know if there's ever going to be anything in your stomach. Because the people who brought you here haven't said a word about feeding you. Now they do bring you some food, but even if it weren't disgusting, which it is, you feel too sick to eat it. You eat anyway because you've got to stay alive. That's the only thing you know. You've got to stay alive. It sounds like a nightmare the way I'm describing it, but real people went through that nightmare. Millions of real people. Your ancestors and mine. Are you African American? Go back enough generations in your family and there's somebody on one of those slave ships who went through what I've just told you about. Somebody just as real as your mama. Probably looks something like her too, and for good reason. Somebody just as real as you. Think about that for a minute. Now how do you feel? Money and slavery. When it comes to slavery, what people don't think about is this. Most people who were buying slaves didn't have big money to buy them by the thousands. So who put me on the boat and brought me here? It was the big money folks. There was another group that sold slaves like somebody today sells cars. Let's say you and your brother have a car dealership. You buy the cars from the automaker and I come and buy them from you. The banker lends you the money to get the cars from General Motors. You pay for the cars, then you sell one to me. Slavery was like that. One guy bought slaves and sold them to another guy. But the part that's left out is, whom did the first guy buy them from? Who was the General Motors of the slave trade? For that you've got to go to Europe. Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, they're the ones who came up with the idea. They're the ones who explored the routes to Africa, who bought the slaves from West Africa, or else just took them, and who then went from there to the Americas. They were the ones to make the first profits. The Americans who bought the slaves made a profit too because they turned around and sold them. Excuse me. The ones they sold them to also made a profit because the slaves did their work for free. But the real profits made in America off slavery went other places. Banks handled the money from slave profits, and slave owners paid insurance companies in case something happened to the slaves. And money men in the North made a fortune by investing in those banks and insurance companies. In other words, the wealth of America was built on our backs. Many of those companies are still around. J.P. Morgan, New York Life, Aetna, Lehman Brothers, and a whole lot more. Their money has been passed down from generation to generation of white descendants, and people are born into those families with wealth they didn't do a thing to earn. That's where real white guilt comes in, and meanwhile, you and I are born without a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. Tell that to the next person who asks you, slavery's been over for 150 years, how come black people still don't have anything? What's wrong with you? The continuing inequality can make us angry sometimes. Let's not take it out on one another in our community. We need to struggle together, not against each other. Nat Turner's revolt. Here's an example of how white folks can take something we ought to be proud of and turn it against us. Use it to mess up our minds. Now believe me, I'm not taking anything away from Nat Turner. More people should name their children Nat Turner instead of naming them after football players. Today, 150 some years after the end of slavery, some black folks' minds are still messed up, but it's not our fault. Anybody's mind would be off if all they heard for hundreds of years was that they were nothing. But Nat Turner, that man was living in slavery and didn't let anybody mess up his mind. Didn't take his cues from the oppressor. He was born and enslaved in Virginia in 1800, and slavery was all he knew. Yet he was able to see that that wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was able to resist what racists told him because he was in touch with a higher power, or he thought he was, which I guess added up to the same thing. The thing about Nat Turner was, from the time he was a little boy, people around him, black and white, saw that he was special. They figured he was going to do something great one day, even if he was a slave. If the white folks had known what that something was, they would have killed him right then and there. The man who owned him gave him a Bible, which Nat loved. Also, his mother encouraged him because she thought he had so much potential. Later, Nat and his mama got sold together. After their new owner died, Nat was married by that time. Nat's wife got sold away. That didn't sit right with Nat. Matter of fact, that might have been the thing that pushed him to do what he did. He was still religious, but he wasn't the turn the other cheek kind of religious. More like the I am God's instrument kind. He started praying. I like how he puts that. He started praying and having visions, and everything he saw pointed to fighting against slavery. And when I say fight, I don't mean protest. He looked to the heavens for signs. On February 12th, 1831, he saw a solar eclipse and took it as a sign that it was time to free his people. At first, he planned the revolt for July 4th. Isn't that something? That would have been Independence Day, all right. Then he got sick, so he waited for another sign. One day in August, the sun turned a strange blue-green color. Or so Turner thought it did, and that was the sign he was looking for. He planned the revolt for August 21st and started organizing. He met secretly with just a few others at first. Before they were done, their number grew to about 70, slaves and free blacks alike. The revolt started with Turner's master, Joseph Travis, and his family. Turner and his followers killed them all. Then they moved on to other families, and by the next day they had killed 60 whites. A trail of blood like you never saw. They wouldn't have stopped there, but then came the federal troops. Turner and the others didn't go down without a fight, though. More than 100 slaves died, which is more than the number of white folks they killed. But the white folks left alive didn't forget the uprising. You can believe that. They were scared out of their minds. They captured Turner on October 30th and killed him on November 11th. Today we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th, but next time it's Veterans Day, think about Nat Turner. He sacrificed as much for his people as anybody wearing the uniform of the U.S. military. Everybody talks about Nat Turner, even those who don't know exactly what he did. And that's the problem. When people talk about slave revolts, he is the only name you hear. White folks who have you think that in almost 250 years of slavery, there was only one dude with enough balls to say, I'm going to be free or die trying. And if every other slave who ever lived was either happy to be picking cotton and saying, yassa, 700 times a day, or too scared to do a thing about it. The truth is, there were a lot of slave revolts. For one thing, before Nat Turner, there was Denmark Vesey. He was a free black man. He bought his freedom in 1800. Bought it. And then worked as a carpenter in South Carolina. Made a good living too, but he wasn't satisfied being free when other black folks were still under the lash. So he organized a revolt. You don't hear as much about Vesey as you do Nat Turner because Vesey's rebellion got uncovered before it could take place. But Vesey and his crew were serious. They collected more than 500 daggers, bayonets, and spears. They would have used them too, but whites got wind of what was happening, and that was the end of that. Vesey and others were executed. And Vesey and Turner, after Vesey and Turner, the revolts kept up. In 1835, whites hanged a bunch of slaves and whipped others to death because they were about to rebel. In 1853, in New Orleans, 2,500 slaves got ready to fight, but one free black man informed on them. You can believe that man is still burning in hell. In fact, I'd throw some coals and kindling on the fire if I knew where to go looking for him. A whole lot of black folks resisted slavery. Ever heard of Maroons? They were slaves who ran away, formed groups, and lived together. Some of them had been captured in Africa and put on ships, but ran away as soon as they reached America. A lot of them even tried to get back home. In 1856, a group of Maroons terrorized whites in a couple of counties in North Carolina. Whites got so scared and nervous, in fact, that they didn't know what to do. Some of them stopped sleeping. They just stayed up all night waiting for black people to try something else. The revolts I'm telling you about, these are just the ones nobody saw fit to write down. Nobody knows how many more there were. These are just the ones somebody saw fit to write down. Is that what I said? Vesey, Turner, and the Maroons were the blacks who took up arms. Other blacks fought slavery in other ways. Take a look at a piece of writing published in 1829. A black man named David Walker called the Appeal. Walker was a free black man who wanted other blacks to be free too by killing their masters if need be. As Malcolm X would have said, by any means necessary. Take a look at what Walker wrote. They want us for their slaves and think nothing of murdering us. And believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. You hear what he was saying? Don't let anybody tell you black folks were slaves because we were happy that way. Happy folks don't take up arms. We took up arms. Frederick Douglass. I want you to check out something that Frederick Douglass wrote in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, and this too in some cases, when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the parties, and those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. What my man Frederick Douglass is saying here is some heavy stuff. It just goes to show you that as much as slavery messed up people's bodies, it messed up their minds even more. It was bad enough that black people had to work for nothing for Colonel Lloyd, Jacob Jepson, and hundreds of thousands of other evil men just like them. It was bad enough that we got whipped and sold away from our parents and children and husbands and wives. It was bad enough that our lives were not our own, but what's worse than that is the slaves who identified with their masters, as if the slaves' value as human beings depended on what the masters were like. What they were like was evil. They were called masters because they owned human beings. And we slaves were ready to fight each other over which of the low-down, filthy dogs who owned us was the best. But it wasn't the slaves' fault. Like Douglass wrote, slaves are like other people. When you think about it, it's a wonder more black folks didn't fight with one another instead of fighting against the white man the way Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, David Walker, and a whole lot of others did. While you're busy shaking your head over some dumb slaves, ask yourself this: are we any better today? Black people put on the uniform of the U.S. military, our masters, and go to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and anywhere else Uncle Sam tells us to go and fight and kill yellow-skinned folks and brown-skinned folks on behalf of the United States, our masters, just like slaves fighting other slaves. Meanwhile, back home, 1 out of every half-dozen blacks is locked up for committing the same drug crimes as white dudes who walk around free. What's wrong with that picture? Then you've got blacks in police uniforms out there arresting other blacks. Blacks in America really need to study the Jews in Germany. Those Jews never thought they were part of Hitler's system. They never sided with the people oppressing them. We do. We go to war. What kind of abomination is that? How many blacks go to war because we can't find a job and are willing to kill or be killed just so we can feed ourselves and our families? Getting back to Frederick Douglass, it's like he said, slaves are like other people. Too many of us have that slave mentality. It can take a lot to get past that, but a lot of us have, and Frederick Douglass was one. He was born into slavery 1818 in Maryland. He wasn't with his mother long enough to remember her well, and the only thing he knew about his father was that he might have been the man who owned him. Douglass shows what you can accomplish when your mind is free. He was somewhat free. A black woman purchased Frederick Douglass's freedom. He married the black woman, Anna, but he spent most of his time running around with German women, ignoring his uneducated wife. He was taught to read when he was 8 years old by one of his owners, a white lady. What he didn't learn from her, he picked up himself, sometimes by tricking white boys into showing him how to read and write words. When he got a little bit older, his rebelliousness came to the surface. Most teenagers start to rebel, but Douglas was one teenager with something to rebel against. He got a hold of some anti-slavery writings, and that fed his anger even more. Soon this got to be too much for his owner, who sent him to another plantation so they could break him. That only made Douglas more determined. A slave driver, Mr. Covey, beat him one day until he was covered in blood, but the next time he tried to lay a hand on him, he had a fight on his hands. It lasted a good couple of hours. This time, Covey was the one doing the bleeding. He never came near Douglas again. As Douglas wrote in his narrative, this battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. Career as a slave. That cracks me up. Fred had a sense of humor. Books say he escaped from slavery in 1838 when he was 20, using seaman's papers he had borrowed, then gave lectures for money for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Later he started his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star, in 1847. In 1852, on the day after Independence Day, Douglas gave a speech for the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. The speech was later called, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" Douglas talked about America's most special holiday, and he told it like it was, exactly like it was. He started off so nice and meek that he almost seemed to be apologizing for being there. But then when he got all those white folks all relaxed and comfortable, he sprang this on them. "Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilege irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. That was Fred. All white folks had to do was teach him to use their language, and he was able to use it a lot better than most of them ever would. After the Civil War started, he helped recruit black soldiers for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment to fight against the South and slavery. Years later, after the war was over, the president appointed him minister to Haiti. Fred was one black man who believed in himself and his own potential. Not bad for a dude who started off as somebody else's property, right? Thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, you know what to do. In the meantime, we'll see you next time. Thank you.